For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michelle Robichaud, and I have the absolute honor of being able to introduce our wonderful first keynote speaker, and that is the Reverend Dr. Andy O'Neill. I have a little bit to say about him, and it's all good. Andy was born in Nova Scotia and raised in Dartmouth, and had a few missteps in life. The first was doing economics, but went into seminary afterward. And I'll say this quietly, Emmanuel. He did his PhD in Edinburgh and has been in pastoral ministry for 15 years after that, and has been, during that time, he was also teaching sessionally at the Atlantic School of Theology, and has since 2021 been on faculty. And I have the absolute pleasure of being able to say that I was one of his students for United Church Worship, and he is fantastic. So if you ever get a chance for the Con Ed, it's totally worth it. He is married to Jenny and is the father of Jonathan and Margaret. His approach to theology is quite holistic. It is to reflect on human life and to allow theology to describe that experience. So it's a correlation of experience and revelation. As somebody who is quite wonderfully well-rounded, we have a number of talents that he not only has perfected, but is working towards. So there's the singing and the drumming and amateur carpentry. So the amateur carpentry is a good antidote to a vocation that never seems to end. It's never finished. It's always in flux. So with all of that said, I can say with extreme happiness and wonder and awe that we will be hearing something extraordinary from the Reverend Dr. Andy O'Neill, because he always has such interesting things to say. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker for today, the Reverend Dr. Andy O'Neill.
How is that? Can you hear me? Great. Thank you very much, Michelle. With an introduction like that, I can only hope to disappoint you. So I will try my best. If you would bring up the first slide, please, Stephen. The Way It Is by William Stafford. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread. But it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. There were 5 people who were traveling on an airplane when the pilot came back and said that both engines were failing and the plane was sure to crash. And there were 5 parachutes on that plane, and he was taking one of them and he jumped out. So there were 5 people on a plane with 4 parachutes left. Now, the first person who spoke for one was the director of the World Health Organization, who said, I have a very important job. So many millions of lives depend on me. I must take one of these. And so he took one and jumped out. The second person who spoke for a parachute said, I am on the verge of discovering a universal cure for cancer. I must take one of these parachutes. So she grabbed one and jumped out. So there were 3 people and 2 parachutes left. And an assistant theology professor from Atlantic School of Theology stood up and said, well, I'm the smartest person I know, so I have to take one of these. So he grabbed one and jumped out. Now, there were 2 people left on the plane and 1 parachute, a student and a teacher. And the teacher looked at the student and said, I have lived my life. I have learned and given what I can. You are just beginning. You should take the last parachute. And the student looked at her teacher and said, I would have expected nothing less from you, but you don't have to worry, because the smartest man in the world just grabbed my knapsack. Before I begin formally, I want to thank the conference planning team for their invitation, Michelle Robichaud for patiently answering all of my questions by email leading up to today, and also to Orville James for his gracious hospitality upon my arrival. I already feel blessed and welcomed. I also want to begin with something of a confession to you, which is that as I was preparing for this conference, I thought about the strongest, most resilient people that I know and have met. And I realized something very important. This is a bit of a disclaimer at the beginning here. I have never experienced racism or abuse. I have never experienced violence or neglect at the hands of another person or system. I have sat with and listened to and cared for and prayed for people who have trusted me with their stories of the harm that has been done to them and how they have exhibited resilience. But I can in no way claim to speak for them. As a person who has benefited from every privilege the Western world has to offer, there are so many stories and narratives about which I am simply unqualified to speak, including all of yours. So I bring with me all I can testify to. First, the human condition, and second, the faithfulness of God, which means that I see my work here, as in all of my avenues of life, not as authoritative, but as prayerful reflection. I have done nothing to deserve the privilege of speaking to you in the way that I am being asked to do. So I want to make clear that I am genuinely humbled to be asked to do so. I also wanted to say that for a conference theme as expansive as resilience, I recognize that we are blessed with a richness of questions and issues and approaches that so many wise and thoughtful presenters will help us explore. Like you, I'm actually just as excited to learn from them. And I'm appreciative of the fact that in their sharing of their expertise, they allow me to focus on the theology that I've been working with for about 20 years. One that tries to articulate human existence as both frail and faulty, and also as infused with God's mercy and love. My understanding of the task of theology has been greatly influenced by the theologian Paul Tillich. I also carry the personal conviction that theology is at its best when it is not merely critical of culture and society, but when it tries to offer repairs to unhelpful and harmful ways of thinking. As a parent, I'm also in a season of wonder and humility at God's transforming love and precious sacredness of this life. So let me just offer some signposts for what I hope to explore in my presentations. I want to focus on 3 aspects of resilience, which is convenient because apparently I'm giving 3 presentations. The first is that I want to start close in with our personal need for authenticity. That is an honesty about ourselves and to ourselves about what it means to be created in the image of God. Our understanding of the relationship between the human condition and the Imago Dei is, I believe, not only at the root of our resilience as care for ourselves, but also of our compassion for others. In tomorrow's session, I want to broaden that out a little bit to consider what resilience means for the church by considering some of the ways in which God is actively at work in a critical decentering of privilege and a radical reshaping of the church as we speak. And finally, on Wednesday, I want to reframe slightly our contemporary notion of hope. And I want to do so in favor of a theology of trust. It's a nuance that I'm working with that I'd like to test out with you. The inventor of the Dyson Cyclone vacuum cleaner, James Dyson, apparently went through 5,126 prototypes before alighting on the vacuum that we know now. He says that each failure helped him to learn something crucial to the overall design. Now, I think that his mother might have said that each failure kept him living in her basement rent-free for another day, but apparently she still loved him. Failure is an integral part of learning and discovery. In fact, we fail more often than we succeed, and yet we are incredibly uncomfortable talking about it. In her book, No Cure for Being Human, Kate Bowler argues that how we describe our lives to ourselves is essential to how we survive and thrive. She writes, "It's really hard to give up on the feeling that the life you want is just out of reach. A beach body by summer, a trip to Disneyland around the corner, a promotion on the horizon. Everyone wants to believe that they are headed toward good, better, best. But what happens when that life gets put on hold?" Notice that Bowler doesn't ask here what happens if that life gets put on hold, but when it gets put on hold. She is not a pessimist. She is a survivor of cancer and is therefore very grateful for her life. I recommend her book to you. But her experience leads her to remind us that life entails, includes, and in fact guarantees challenge, suffering, and loss. Her point is that if we anticipate that our life will be a steady march of improvement toward everything we want, then even our blessings will be subsumed in a narrative of disappointment. So I think this offers us at least a starting point for a definition of resilience, not just how we bounce back, but the extent to which we anticipate having to do so throughout the course of our lives. If challenge and suffering and loss are understood as intrusions on what should otherwise be a picture-perfect life, then our resilience will be low. If we accept, however, as Stafford writes, that tragedies happen, that people get hurt or die, and that we suffer and get old, then our resilience begins from a more realistic starting point. In short, resilience is how we respond to the events and situations that no one wants to experience, but which everyone does. The stress, anxiety, exhaustion, disappointment. And because of what informs it, resilience comes from hard-won wisdom. It is the work of a lifetime, summoning courage in the face of fear, finding joy in the midst of sorrow, maintaining hope in the face of despair. One of the greatest challenges to resilience is our culture and society's obsession with progress toward perfection, the pursuit of good, better, best that Bowler identifies. For the church in this season, this assumption of progress is especially harmful. Until recently, our faithfulness usually resulted in success. If we were committed to God's work, our congregations would grow. Today, this simply is not the case. I'm going to focus a little bit more on that tomorrow as we try to reframe the story of the church in this season. So for today, I want to focus just for a little bit on the assumption of progress and perfection in a personal sense. And then I want to turn to a theological framework of human existence as a possible repair to those embedded assumptions. Incidentally, does anybody know who this is before I begin? It's a good guess. Sandy Koufax? No. It was a memorable game for any baseball fan, at least for one of my father's age, because it was the only perfect game pitched. John is nodding. Don Larson, exactly. The only perfect game pitched in a World Series history. 0 hits, 0 runs, 0 errors. You can see it on the scoreboard there, the Yankees. There have been around 600 World Series games played over the past 123 years, and one perfect game. One. It is a singular and unmatched performance by the New York Yankees pitcher Don Larson, which pleases my father, who is a Yankees fan, and as a Red Sox fan, me, not so much. You could be forgiven for not knowing his name because he wasn't even the best pitcher on his team. There was little else to distinguish Larson, in fact, or his career, and certainly his life. In fact, I just learned this year. On the day that he pitched this game, his wife was filing for divorce. My point is that perfection is elusive and infinitesimally rare. By definition, it is not the norm, and even when it is achieved, it does not spill over into other aspects of our lives. It is not something to aim or hope for. The expectation of perfection breeds fragility and feelings of failure. Worse, expecting perfection of others breeds disappointment and contempt. An important question for us with respect to resilience is why we so often expect perfection of ourselves and others when we know this to be true. In his book, Notes on a Nervous Planet, Matt Haig offers a powerful testimony of how the internal logic of perfectionism, combined with societal expectations of progress and self-improvement, create a dissatisfaction that pervades even our greatest triumphs. He writes, "You will be happy when you get good grades. You will be happy when you go to university. You will be happy when you go to the right university. You will be happy when you get a job. You will be happy when you get a promotion. You will be happy when you work for yourself. You will be happy when you are rich. You will be happy when you own an olive grove in Sardinia. You will be happy when you have transcended earthly woes, when you are one with the universe. You will be happy when you are the universe. You will be happy when you are a god, when you are the god to rule all gods. You will be happy when you are Zeus in the clouds, above Mount Olympus, commanding all things. You will be happy. Maybe. A mentor of mine once referred to this kind of narrative as a tape that plays in your head. It may not sound exactly like this for you, but it's the kind of anxiety that places fulfillment in a future benchmark that once achieved creates new benchmarks. As long as the future is where our fulfillment lives, then we will never meet it in the present. And this doesn't only arise when I compare my current life to the life I think I should have, or who I am with who I want to be. It also arises when I compare myself with others. And if you're anything like me, you know that when we compare ourselves with others, we're usually the ones who come out on the losing end. Comparing ourselves to others is a normal part of being human. But most of the time, what we're comparing is our insides to other people's outsides, what we feel to what we see and imagine and believe about other people, but don't actually know. As I heard it put recently, we don't see people as they are, we see them as we are. We take the incomplete data of other people's lives, comprising either the little that we can see or what they want us to see, and we compare it to how we feel about ourselves. We read other people and their lives through the lens of our self-esteem at that moment. Now, I know that's probably never happened to any of you, but I know when I hear comments about how well the church over town is doing, or maybe about that nice new car that my friend got, the tape plays again. The lives of most other people, though, will only ever be to us like a car commercial. What we see are the white-toothed smiles of the beautiful family in a shiny new car. What we don't see are the kids in the back seat fighting over who farted or who's taking up too much room. We don't hear the parents' worries about the cost of gas or trouble at work or an ailing parent. In other words, we don't see what's on their insides, which is why we're so surprised when someone courageous enough to name something they are struggling with names the very thing that we are struggling with as well. Behind every outward appearance, there is a soul longing to be free. For some, they long to be seen, to be truly known or understood by another, or simply to be loved. Others long to know their calling, their purpose in life, their vocation. For some, longing causes various forms of anxiety and results in attempts to control or master themselves, their environment, or perhaps even other people. While for others, it's at the heart of life and adventure. In German, one of the words that expresses human longing is Sehnsucht, literally the search for being, or searching after we don't know what. We catch glimpses of the transcendent in our encounters with beauty and mystery. Poetry and music and dance can articulate the soul's longing for its home, its birthplace, its source. And this longing for what is eternal and universal to the human experience is a gift at the heart of most of our philosophy and religion and culture. But our longing can also at times take on what research psychologist Brené Brown calls near enemies. That is, feelings that mimic what is healthy and positive, but which actually betrays what is healthy and positive. So, for example, perseverance, sticking with something that is hard but worthwhile, is a virtue. The near enemy of perseverance, especially in a work setting, would be pushing through or toughing it out. Just keep going until it's done. Ignoring the impact that pushing ourselves is having on our bodies and our minds and our relationships. Again, I'm sure that none of you know about that. But to my thinking, our innate human longing has two near enemies that we see in our work and in the church. One is optimism and the other is nostalgia. Now, when it's healthy, optimism is the buoyant and frequently genial characteristic of seeing the best in other people and situations. It provides an energy that we all need, a positive perspective. But when it is unhealthy, when it becomes a near enemy, then optimism casts all of our hope into the future, implicitly diminishing any hope that might exist in the present. For example, many congregations hope that children will come back to the church. And if this inspires them to analyze their context and to take action, then their optimism is fruitful. If, however, it causes them to become resigned to the present and to simply locate their hope in another day or another person or another generation, then it drains the present of any possibility before even beginning. Optimism. Similarly, when it's healthy, nostalgia can be the love of family tradition at Christmas time or a fond memory of someone we love. But when it's unhealthy, nostalgia casts all joy into the past. Again, for example, congregations long for the days when sanctuaries and offering plates were full to bursting. These memories can inspire us to critical reflection and creativity, or they can paralyze us in despair and drain the present of the joy that God is offering us now in this season. And my aim here is not to heap judgment on struggling congregations, nor is it to imply that our longing is bad. Quite the opposite. My aim is to say clearly that both our struggle and our longing are innately human. And what I hope to offer now is a theological framework that accounts honestly for both our imperfection and our hope. Some of you know that I studied Paul Tillich in my research, and he was trained as a Lutheran pastor and forced to leave Germany in 1933 when he emigrated to the United States and wrote almost exclusively in his adopted language of English until his death in 1965. During his lifetime, he was read widely both inside and outside of seminaries, but his theology has received diminishing attention since. And I will be honest, because of his training in philosophy, a lot of his writing can be cumbersome, and some of it is impenetrable. However, he was also greatly misinterpreted by some who confused his work as natural theology or trying to reason his way to God without revelation. And it is true. He sought to describe a relationship between revelation and reason in a way that could include the discoveries of philosophy and emerging understandings of human self-consciousness. For example, from Hegel, he had learned that the individual, in philosophy, the self, is not defined in a vacuum, but gradually takes shape with each new experience with others, so that each time we reach out of ourselves, we experience a change in us. We are different because of that encounter. And when we return to our self-reflection, we are doing it now differently because of the interaction. In other words, there is no I without other I's, without we. Self-consciousness is not the province of the individual, rather it develops socially. That's the kind of thing that Tillich would have been learning. But ideas like this for him are not mere sophistry, esoteric ruminations. Rather, they help inform the work that he was doing in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust and Hiroshima. Tillich was keen to offer a renewed theology that went beyond two problematic accounts of humanity that were becoming prevalent in the 20th century. On one hand, the secular impulses of individualism and capitalism, a desire to see constant progress as being our salvation. And on the other, a supernatural fundamentalism that obscures the work of God in people's daily lives and makes exclusive truth claims for Christianity. At the foundation of all of his writing, however, is the very faithful belief that God's kerygma or message or gospel is always speaking into the human situation. The gospel is revealed in Jesus Christ within the brokenness and finitude of our life and history. Now, his starting point is probably familiar to you. In the first volume of the Systematic Theology, he describes God as being itself. That is, infinite possibility, divine essence, the source of all things. Where by contrast, our being, human being, is finite. It is limited. We are created in the image of God, but we are not God. Our lives are a set of many possibilities, but ultimately we are bound by time and space. So this duality of our finite human being and infinite divine being, or being itself, is an approach to theology that's called ontological. Now, that doesn't really matter. You don't need to remember that. There's no test at the end. But essentially, where it begins is by virtue of existing, we are connected to God at a level that cannot be changed. That is ontological theology. Our connection to God is within the structures of existence itself. Within our existence, however, we also come to know that we are not God, and we experience that knowledge as estrangement, as anxiety, and even despair. This is what gives rise to Sehnsucht, to deep longing for something other, something more, something we don't know what. That's hard to articulate, but is nonetheless common to all human experience. Now, in one sense, we touch our limits. We realize that we are mortal, or as Tillich puts it, we realize that there is nothing that we can do to bridge the gap between our finite existence and our infinite source, between us and God. We cannot accomplish that ourselves. In another sense, however, Tillich says that knowing this can be liberating. It allows us to come to terms with the fact that while we are fearfully and wonderfully made, we are not God. We are imperfect reflections of God. In a book, An Other Kingdom, Walter Brueggemann echoes this, saying, failing to be God is not an affliction. It is a necessity of being human. Grief is the facing of this imperfection and the impossibility of attaining more or avoiding failure and loss. But as we heard Bowler say in more familiar words, There is no cure for being human. But knowing that we can't become perfect, that we can't become God, that doesn't stop us from trying. Our lives and human history are full of our efforts to play God, to try to replace the ground of our being with other things, and principally with ourselves. We see this repeated over and over again in Scripture. For example, in the literal idolatry of the golden calf following the Exodus, or in Abraham having a child with Hagar rather than waiting on God's promise, David's betrayal of Uriah, Judas's betrayal of Jesus. The error in each case may be given a different name, but boils down to a human trying to fulfill God's vision on his or her own terms, hastening the promise. And as for our ancestors of faith, so for us. When we assume the place of God and seek after our own ends, we become estranged from God, both in the personal sense and in the more grotesque periods of human history. Everything we do to hurt one another results from the desire to fashion others and the world in our own image. And the result is that we become estranged from each other and from our true selves, from who we were created to be. Now, if all of this has you gasping for some breath of hope, the second volume of the Systematic Theology is a welcome reprieve, but we're not going there today. I just want to give you a signpost that Tillich describes God's gracious response to our limitation, the impossibility of us bridging that gap in the person of Jesus, who becomes the Christ, of course. Christ also reveals the goal, the telos, or the purpose, if you will, of all of human life, to be the reunion of our existence with essence, which he finds symbolized in the kingdom. We'll return to that in session 3. But for now, there are 3 things that I feel this ontological approach to theology accomplishes that are vital to understanding ourselves and that inform the notion of resilience. First, if our connection to God is at the level of being, this fundamental structure, then our faith does not stand or fall according to our virtue. Our salvation doesn't depend on whether we, or humanity for that matter, are progressing good, better, best. Rather, our faith is in God, who is present in all things, steps forward and steps back, redeeming life and history in the midst of the worst of them, as well as in the best. Second, then, this approach to theology sees God not as a deus ex machina, who may or may not reach a hand in to save the good and defeat the bad, if that matches with God's whim at that moment. Rather, it puts God at the heart of all creation, willing what is good for all creation. This is especially important in times of personal struggle and in this age of relative church decline. Tomorrow, I want to look at the ways in which the church is actually not in decline. But for now, I believe that God, as being itself, guarantees that it is not possible for us to imagine a time when God abandons us. Our scriptures begin with just such a description of God's relationship to the created. Let us create humankind in our image. Mutual relationship is at the heart of both the divine life of the Godhead and at the heart of humanity's relationship with that God. This is what till it calls the courage to be. And finally, this approach to theology describes what we know from experience but find hard to articulate or to admit, that even as we follow in the way of Jesus, we are only human. And this is especially crucial as we imagine why it is, as we follow in the way of Jesus, yet the church is in decline. Now, Paul, of course, suggests that we fall short of the glory of God. There is an implication in Paul of a fundamental defect in humanity that would later provide the basis for doctrines like original sin in Augustine or total human depravity in Calvin, and many other discouraging theologies of human deficiency that emphasize our distance, our radical distance from God. So what I find empowering about this theological approach is that it underscores our fundamental connection to God, our fundamental connection in God. And it insists that two things are true at the same time. One, that we are far, far from perfect, and that we are always grounded in every moment in the source of life itself. This is a theological approach that I think unites honesty with courage. And as a kind of a shorthand, I want to call this a theology of authenticity. And I believe that this has an impact on the way that we treat ourselves and the way that we treat others. And as I begin to bring things to a close, I want to illustrate that with a few simple examples. During COVID, our little family remained isolated for 2 years. My side of the family is a kind of murky swamp of immunocompromised and chronically ill genes, including both my sister and me. So Jenny and I took the decision that we would keep our children as safe as we could while we didn't have any other information about what happens to unvaccinated children who get COVID. We considered ourselves lucky, actually. I was able to work from home. Jenny is a teacher, and so she was able to homeschool the kids. But I don't think I need to tell you that 4 people isolated in a house for 2 years is challenging. In a passage from her novel, All Adults Here, Emma Straub has a character reflect on parenthood, saying, "Some people imagine that the hardest part of parenting is managing behavior or sleeplessness or a complete lack of privacy. All of these are true. But the hardest part of parenting is figuring out how to do the right thing 24 hours a day forever and surviving all of the times you fail." I have failed many times as a parent. And in order to make it through that difficult time, especially those early months, you remember we were just going to be at home for 2 weeks. One of the things that we did every weekday, I wish I could claim it as my idea, but it was Jenny's. We checked in on how we felt. Check in. And we did it with this feelings chart that you can see here. This was our homemade version of similar tools that you can find online. The 4 quadrants are all full of different descriptions of feelings along 2 axes. The strength of the feeling that you're having and whether that feeling is positive or negative. There was a long trough when a lot of us were just feeling bored at the beginning of the day. But the intention of a chart like this is to help us articulate what we feel, because when we can describe what we're feeling, we're more able to reflect on why we might feel that way. It was fascinating, actually, how many times the feeling that we were describing was not because of COVID, but because of other things that were happening in life, obviously COVID being that undergirding constant thing. But resilience researchers Seth Pennick and Hugh Albert suggest that this kind of personal clarification helps us to develop conscious responses to stressful situations or disappointment, rather than to react out of anxiety and fear. It's just kind of that first step. Paul Hutchinson from the Coromila Peace Initiative in Northern Ireland has been facilitating difficult conversations, much more difficult conversations than our breakfast time ones in my house, for 30 years, since the Good Friday Agreement, between groups of people who were literally deathly opposed to each other, and whose conflict killed over 3,000 people. I heard him speak a few years ago at Berwick Camp, a family church camp that my family and Anne and others go to. I've been attending it for 40 years. I remember very clearly two things that Paul said about the lifelong process of building peace. Peace inside ourselves, peace with others. First, he told the story of a woman who came to Coromila with her daughter and grandson for a 3-day retreat. At the end of it, she approached Paul and said gruffly, "When I came here, I hated my daughter, and I thought my grandson was a numpty. Now I realize she's exhausted, and they're both doing the best they can." Paul said that the work of peace is to build golden bridges on which people who have become set at odds can retreat. Compassion is building golden bridges on which people with whom we're at odds can retreat. And second, he said, this doesn't mean that the work of peace is to forgive and forget. Rather, it is to remember and change. There is a Japanese pottery technique called kintsugi. It's the process of adding gold dust to repairs in pottery such that the repair is highlighted and transformed. Here, beauty is not blemished. Beauty is enhanced, not by covering up the blemish, but in a sense by highlighting the wound, the fracture. We don't use Photoshop to pretend that it never existed. Rather, beauty is authentic to the piece. It is honest and true. The restored piece retains the memory of both the break and the healing, so that neither are covered up. Both are integral to its story. But this is much more than, as the old song says, accentuating the positive. It is more than what Brené Brown calls toxic positivity, the desperate attempt to find a silver lining to every cloud, which of course inadvertently diminishes our experience and the pain of others with well-meaning sentiments like that one about closing doors and opening windows. Instead, we gain strength when we place our wounds in the larger context of our healing and blessings. This may be the last time I quote her, but I'm not sure. Brené Brown talks about this as the difference between recovery and resilience. Recovery, she says, is based on the hope that at some point, the grief that we carry will end. But you and I know, we know from our experiences that this simply isn't true. Our feelings of loss and loneliness, of inadequacy and regret, they don't just go away. Even if they're not always top of mind, we carry them with us always. There's no cure for being human. Resilience, on the other hand, she says, assumes that we will carry grief with us, but we also believe that it doesn't have to control us. Resilience seeks ways to cope with our feelings, to be honest and realistic about our lives, to be honest about our wounds, our fractures, in ways that allow us to continue finding joy in the life that we have. And one of the main practices that Brown talks about as being common to resilient people, people who not only survive but thrive, is gratitude. Gratitude does not deny struggle, but it does recognize blessings in the midst of struggle, in the midst of the usual chaos and disappointment and busyness of life. For example, that beautiful day at the beach that I remember so fondly with my family also included my daughter filling 2 diapers when we had only come with 1. Most of our moments, most of our lives are a mixture of this kind of frailty and beauty at the same time. And I would argue that gratitude is not only at the root of us being able to appreciate joy in our lives, but is also the root of our compassion for others. Because in dealing more graciously with ourselves, we also find the strength to deal graciously with others. If we're honest about the things with which we struggle, we can more easily recognize the struggles of other people, even when those struggles are hidden behind irritating or dismissive or even hurtful behaviors. But finally, while we can draw strength and solidarity from each other, we are also not alone the only source of our strength. We are united with God at a level that goes far deeper than we can think or feel or imagine or articulate. We are connected to the ground of our being simply by virtue of being alive. And we are also, as we'll consider tomorrow, part of a church that is both a community in itself and also part of a much larger network of community, of God's community, that is essential to our flourishing and our work as God's people. I want to close with a personal story. At a particularly low point in my life, I found myself alone on the beach near my parents' home. It is a rare treat to be alone on the beach. The year before, the professional path that I felt I had been on for 15 years suddenly vanished, and I was completely lost. I went through a period of depression. I carried some anger. Alone on the beach that day, 2 things made themselves very clear. The first is that I was not alone. During that difficult year, my partner Jenny had gently and regularly reminded me of my blessings. I know you're hurting, she would say, but look at what we have, a loving and healthy family and each other. I realized that for many years, I had been taking these things for granted. If not in my behavior, then at least they had faded into the background as I focused on whatever next thing I didn't have yet. But that was a turning point for me. I would say I was born that day because I recalled that for as long as I could remember, I had felt called to be a father. The second thing that became clear to me was that God was calling me to lay down the full weight of my burden, of my own self-concern. During that low point in my life, my prayer had been simple, but with a lot of edge. What do you want from me? A question, a demand, a challenge, a plea. What do you want? And I wish that I could tell you that I heard a voice clearly that day alone on the beach. I wish I could tell you that the clouds parted and a ray of sunshine illuminated the glinting waves. But instead, on that day on the beach, all I heard was the repeated crashing of waves on the sand. I cried. And as I cried, the waves crashed over and over again. They crashed. Eventually, they were the only sound. And then something changed, because I began to hear the waves not as replacing God's voice, but as God's voice. God's steady, reassuring, repeated refrain. I am here. I am here. I don't know how that story ends. Accepting disappointment, being grateful for blessings, trying to live faithfully. These provide no guarantee for the future. They do, however, allow us to live authentically now. To live in this moment knowing that God is with us, that God loves us, that God surrounds us with love, if we would but have eyes to see it and ears to hear it. This is the thread that I follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. You don't ever let go of the thread. Thank you. Am I supposed to stay up here? Okay. Okay.
I don't know if there's somebody who's hosting the questions. My mic is not on now, please. Okay, that's 1, 2, 3. So we get my mic working in a minute. I can vaguely hear myself through the earbuds. So, Andy, I don't know if there was anybody who set up the thank you yet, but I do think that we need time for questions.
Absolutely.
And I'm stealing the mic because I'm aware that there's about 16 people online, as well as all of us in the room, and they want to have questions too. So I will be watching the questions from here on Zoom, and if there's anybody online who would like to ask a question, I would encourage you please to oh, there we go. I've got a mic. How about that? I don't have to shout. Hooray. I would invite those of you who are online who'd like to be a part of this, let me know in the chat so that I can kind of bring you in at the right time. But then if you would like to open your mic and ask the question, I can put your picture up on the screen, I can play your voice into the room, and we can all know that you're here and a part of this. If you're here in the room, Alan has a mic, it's a handheld mic. And I'm sure he's going to disinfect it between people so that we don't spread any horrendous germs. But we do need you to use a mic. You can't just shout and scream. We've got a couple of mics in the room that are here to pick up ambient sound. I'm listening away on my earbuds, and I can tell you they are not great. So if you want people in Iqaluit to hear you, you really do need to use the mic in order to be heard. So having said that, I don't know if there's anybody who is monitoring the questions or moderating the questions. Is there not? Because if there isn't, I will do that. Apparently I'm doing that. There we go. I could even find my camera and turn it over to me so that the people online can see me. How about that? Where am I? Down, down, down. There I am. Okay, now the people online can see what I look like. And I can put this over there so that people can see it too. Anyway, are there questions in the room? Maybe we should take a question in the room first. There's a question behind you there, Alan.
Why don't you just hold it, and that way, there we go. I wanted to thank you for reaffirming or affirming in my own, the importance of the idea of a ground of all being. Because my suspicion is, like, in my outside my congregation, within my community, people might not be able to say it this way, but they basically reject the possibility of like a ground of all being, and that ends that whole angst and tension around not being able to be God, because there is no God. So, you know, the only project that really concerns one is their own ability, right, and their own sense. So it's just thinking about, how do we even begin to share that idea of the ground of all being with people who would just reject that idea as being unnecessary and only causing a burden on people and giving them a source of tension that doesn't really exist.
God, it's an excellent question. I appreciate that. And you're also, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Don, you're also anticipating, you know, how we're going to talk about this in the next 2 sessions as well. So I don't want to step too much on that, but what I will say is, you have probably met people in your life who carry that faithful confidence. That is not confidence in themselves, but confidence in the fact that God is at work in them and in others. When we meet people like that, there is a kind of, we see it. We know that when we meet someone like that. Now, sometimes that can, you know, the near enemy of that is a kind of a charisma or a cult of personality. So those two things can be confused at times. But I think if we think about the people we know who genuinely carry that kind of that faithful confidence, that authentic confidence, which is in God, they know it. I think what we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next couple of sessions is that is what churches are called to demonstrate to their surrounding communities and to the people who are in need. So you've probably heard St. Francis, or the quote, at least that's attributed to him, that at all times we preach the gospel, and if we have to, we use words. So what I would say, just as an initial response to what you're saying, is I'm not going to rush out and start sharing the systematic theology of Paul Tillich with people. What I am going to do is try to integrate what that faithful confidence looks like for me and for my church community in such a way that it reaches people through our faithful action. And that's how I would initially answer that anyway. Yeah.
Thanks, Sandy. So I've got a question from Nuboku, and I just wrote her a quick note to see whether she wanted to open her mic and ask the question herself. So, Nuboku, if you'd like to do that, I would be delighted to bring you up, and otherwise I'll just read what you've written to me.
I have turned on my mic, but I can't find my camera. Oh, it's on. When you were talking about Tillich, you said something like, and I might not have this right, our desire is to create a world in our own image, different from whom we are created to be. And I kind of heard that as a negative, and I understand why that would be a negative. But I also think about, how does that work with an idea or a concept of a social gospel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, another great question. Thank you, Nuboku. The difference between the two is that if I'm trying to order the world or fashion the world or other people in my image, then it's completely subjective. It's about me. It's about how I want others to be like me or to think like me. As opposed to a social gospel, which says, because of my belief in God, because I find the promises of peace and justice revealed in Jesus Christ, I'm going to now work this way for others and for the world. I'm going to, so I'm not trying to fashion others, hopefully, in my image or the world in my image, but rather according to the image of what our created purpose is, which is peace and justice in community. So yeah, that's what I would say is the difference there.
Thanks, Nuboku. Is there somebody else in the room who'd like to ask a question? Okay, let me.
My name's Lynn. I was really struck by your statements around authenticity and the need to be authentically and presently yourself. And I'm curious about how to do that in a culture that's demanding that we be curated and that we be an image and almost a facsimile of ourselves rather than wholly and authentically ourselves. I serve a very small rural pastoral charge that often feels like it's inadequate in the face of the rest of the world because their image to the world is not this pristine, curated place. It's pretty gritty at times, right? So I just want to throw that out to you about what the response would be to that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I wouldn't want to diminish by sort of immediately referring to the beauty of small things, but what I mean by that is what I hear in your question is that you have a congregation that is comparing itself to other congregations and to the world, and that is a great detriment to our authenticity. That is sort of saying, well, I'm not like them, so I'm obviously not good enough. Or if I want to be authentic to how God calls me, then it has to look like that. And that's exactly the point. Thank you very much for bringing it up, because that's exactly the point that we're trying to get to, is that we can't be resilient with that kind of thinking, because we will always be comparing ourselves to others and falling short if that's how we're judging whether we are fulfilled or not. And so authenticity, if I were, so just to revisit, was honesty as well as courage, right? And so it is actually to understand that this is who we are and how we are, and that God loves that God wants us to be who we are. So I don't need to try and look like somebody else or be like somebody else, and that includes for churches. We're going to talk a bit more about that tomorrow, but that's a really helpful observation from within your situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. So we've got a question here from Joy on the line, and she's asked me to read it to you rather than open her mic. So she says, let me get my glasses in focus here. About the major obstacle to resilience is progress, you said. So is the relentless drive of progress that is the obstacle, or is having expectations of the future it's the barrier to resilience? What do you think?
Yes. No, and I mean, I need to be really clear here that, so for example, as a type 1 diabetic, the advances that have occurred in technology and in medical science since I was diagnosed 34 years ago, I wouldn't be here with you if we hadn't had those. So I'm a big believer in, technological progress and medical science and so on, especially when it makes people's lives better. My concern is when this constant drive for what is next, what is better, comes very often without a reflection on whether it will actually be better. What will be, so in economics, we would say, what could be some of the unintended consequences of this particular kind of progress? So for example, I remember about 15 years ago, the case of cloning animals was a really hot topic, at least at that point, within ethics, but also within Christian ethics. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. And so what I would say is that an uncritical belief in progress, an unreflective drive toward what is next is what is the enemy of resilience, not just progress that sort of naturally happens. Yeah.
Terrific, thank you. So is there anyone else in the room here who would like to just say something? Alan is standing there helpfully with the mic. I have a feeling that it's 4:30 in the afternoon. Well, I wonder then if maybe we should draw this to a close for this afternoon and just take a moment to say thank you for starting off the conference with such an interesting collection of stories and thoughts to take away. I will be pondering. I'm a story person. I think I'm going to be pondering the stories that you've shared and some of those wonderful images that you've given us all night, and looking forward to part 2. So thank you so much.